The 91st Psalm is one of the best-known texts in the Bible. It is recited by millions of people in moments of distress, placed in pictures on the walls of homes, and even carried in small versions inside wallets as a symbol of protection. Many see it as an unbreakable shield against all types of danger. But do we really understand what this psalm wants to teach us? Most people cling to the wonderful promises of this text: deliverance from the fowler's snare, protection from pestilence, immunity from arrows, and even the promise that 1,000 will fall by our side, but nothing will reach us. However, there is something deeper behind these words, something that few realize. To understand the true meaning of Psalm 91, we must first delve into its context and the possible identity of whoever wrote it. Unlike other psalms, Psalm 91 does not explicitly mention its author. For centuries, many attributed its authorship to King David, as he was one of the main writers of the Psalms. However, there is a very strong theory that this psalm was actually written by Moses. This completely changes the way we interpret it. If Moses really was the author, it means that this psalm was composed in the midst of the challenges of the desert. Imagine an entire people wandering through arid and dangerous lands, facing hunger, fatigue, and constant threats. In the book of Deuteronomy, we see Moses teaching the people to trust in divine provision, reinforcing the importance of remaining under God's protection. This same concept is reflected in Psalm 91. Furthermore, if we analyze the structure of the book of Psalms, we will see that Psalm 90 makes a direct transition to Psalm 91, and Psalm 90 is attributed to Moses. This suggests that the two may have been written by the same person. In Psalm 90, Moses cries out to God about human weakness and the brevity of life, recognizing the need for refuge in the Lord. Then, in Psalm 91, we see a tone of confidence and security, as if it were the divine answer to that prayer. The possible authorship of Moses also makes sense when we look at the words used in the psalm. Expressions such as the fowler's snare, pernicious pestilence, and thorns and asps refer directly to the challenges that the Israelites faced during their journey in the desert. Another interesting point is the relationship between Psalm 91 and the Ark of the Covenant. In the desert, the Ark symbolized the presence of God among the people. Those who were close to it were, in a sense, dwelling in the secret place of the Most High, as the Ark represented the manifestation of divine glory. This brings us to one of the first great secrets of this psalm. It is not just talking about physical protection, but about spiritual protection that comes from communion with God. The first verse says, "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty." The word dwell indicates permanence, not a sporadic visit. In other words, the promises of Psalm 91 are not for anyone, but for those who live in the presence of God. This detail is often ignored. Most people read this psalm as if it were a kind of mantra, hoping that just reciting it will be enough to guarantee protection. But the words are clear. Whoever receives this protection is the one who dwells, who remains in the hiding place of the Most High. It's not enough to know this hiding place or visit it occasionally. You need to make it your home. This leads us to an essential reflection. Are we actually dwelling in the presence of God, or do we just remember Him when difficulties arise? Many people treat God as an emergency help, turning to Him only in times of crisis. But Psalm 91 makes it clear that true protection lies in continually living in the presence of the Most High. The shadow of the Almighty also carries a powerful meaning. In the biblical context, being under someone's shadow meant being under their authority and care. In the desert, the people of Israel were protected by the cloud of God's presence during the day and by the pillar of fire at night. This reinforces that dwelling in the secret place of the Most High means living under His rule and depending completely on Him. Therefore, before we cling to the promises of deliverance in this psalm, we need to ask ourselves, are we truly dwelling in the presence of God? Are we living under His shadow, under His authority and care? This is the fundamental basis for understanding everything that Psalm 91 has to teach us. And only when we understand this principle can we see the deep secrets that this psalm carries. The 91st Psalm begins with a powerful statement: "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty." In the first part of this study, we understand that this promise is not for anyone, but for those who truly live in the presence of God. But what does this hiding place of the Most High mean? Is it a physical place, or is there a deeper meaning behind this expression? In the original Hebrew, the word translated hiding place is seats. This same word appears in other parts of the Bible and is always associated with something secret, hidden, and inaccessible to those who do not belong to the people of God. In the book of Exodus, God told Moses that he would place him in the cleft of a rock and cover it with his hand, so that he would not die upon seeing his glory. This cleft in the rock was a hiding place, a place where Moses would be protected by God himself. Another fascinating detail is that this word seats it is also linked to the Holy of Holies, the holiest part of the tabernacle, where the Ark of the Covenant was located. In the desert, only the high priest could enter there, and only once a year, on the Day of Atonement. This was a place inaccessible to any ordinary person. If anyone tried to enter without permission, they would die instantly. This shows that the hiding place of the Most High is not just any shelter, but a place of deep intimacy with God. Now notice something impressive. In the New Testament, when Jesus died on the cross, the veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom. This veil was what separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. In other words, what was previously inaccessible has become accessible. The hiding place of the Most High, which was once reserved for a few, is now open to all who come to God through Christ. This means that anyone who truly desires to dwell in the presence of God has this right, but this permanence requires a lifelong commitment. The psalmist continues saying that whoever lives in this hiding place rests in the shadow of the Almighty. The word rest here has a deep meaning. In the original Hebrew, the term used suggests peaceful rest, absolute security. It is interesting to note that this same idea appears in another well-known psalm: "I lie down in peace and then fall asleep, because only you, Lord, make me rest securely." This mentioned rest is not just a momentary relief, but a constant certainty that, regardless of the circumstances, God is our refuge. The concept of shadow in the Bible also has a special meaning. In the desert, where the scorching heat could be deadly, finding shade meant survival. In the spiritual context, being in the shadow of the Almighty means being under His protection and constant care. This image was very powerful for the Israelites as they remembered how God led them through the desert, through the cloud during the day, and the pillar of fire at night. This cloud offered shade and protection against the intense heat, just as God's presence protects us from life's adversities. But does this protection mean that we will never face problems? Does this psalm teach that those who trust in God are exempt from difficulties and tribulations? Many people interpret the 91st Psalm as a guarantee that nothing bad will ever happen to the faithful. However, this is not the central message of the text. When we analyze the entire Bible, we realize that the great men and women of God went through gigantic challenges. Moses faced resistance from Pharaoh and the murmuring of the people in the desert. David, who wrote so many psalms of trust in God, spent years running away from Saul, fearing for his own life. The Apostle Paul, even though he was a faithful servant, suffered persecution, was arrested, and went through countless trials. This means that Psalm 91 is not promising us a life without struggles, but rather absolute security in the midst of adversity. He teaches us that when we make God our refuge, no matter what happens around us, He will be with us and will sustain us. That is the true message of this psalm. Another interesting point is that, in several passages in the Bible, God does not promise to free people from problems, but promises to be with them in the middle of the problem. Look what happened to the 3 young Hebrews in Babylon. They were thrown into the fiery furnace, but God was with them in the fire. Likewise, Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, but God closed the lions' mouths and protected him. These stories show that true divine protection does not mean the absence of challenges, but rather the presence of God even in the midst of storms. Therefore, when we read the 91st Psalm, we need to understand that its true secret lies not in a magical promise of freedom from trouble, but in the assurance that those who dwell in the presence of God will find strength, peace, and refuge regardless of their circumstances. This is one of the greatest spiritual truths hidden in this psalm. It is not an amulet or a magic formula to avoid difficulties, but an invitation to live a life of intimacy with God and trust Him with all your heart. By now, we understand that the 91st Psalm is not just a promise of physical protection, but an invitation to dwell in God's presence and trust in Him unwaveringly. We also saw that the security described in this psalm does not mean the absence of challenges, but rather the certainty that, regardless of what happens, God is with us. But now, an important question arises. What exactly are the dangers mentioned in this psalm? What does it mean to be protected from the fowler's snare, the pernicious pestilence, or the arrows that fly by day? If we analyze these terms carefully, we will realize that Psalm 91 uses language full of military images and spiritual warfare. Many see this psalm as just a comforting devotional text, but few realize that it is also describing a battle reality. The first danger mentioned in the psalm is the fowler's snare. In literal terms, this expression refers to a trap used to capture birds. The hunter prepares a trap almost invisibly, causing the prey to fall into it without realizing it. But spiritually, this image is even deeper. In the Bible, the enemy is often described as someone who sets snares and traps to trap God's children. The Apostle Paul himself warned about the snares of the devil, showing that the enemy does not attack in an obvious way, but works surreptitiously to deceive and mislead God's servants. The fowler's snare therefore represents evil strategies that try to capture people's minds and hearts, moving them away from the truth. This trap can manifest itself in different ways: false teachings, temptations, subtle deceptions, and traps that seem harmless, but that distance us from the presence of God. Soon after, the psalm mentions the pernicious plague. This term takes us back to the plagues that ravaged the ancient world. In Egypt, for example, God sent several plagues as judgment against Pharaoh. However, the idea behind the pernicious plague goes beyond a simple physical illness. In the spiritual context, it represents sudden destruction, calamities that come without warning, and that try to undermine the confidence of the faithful. The pernicious plague can also symbolize evil influences that destroy not only the body, but the soul. Throughout history, we see that it was not just physical epidemics that brought destruction, but also false doctrines, corrupt ideologies, and distorted teachings that spread like plagues, turning people away from God. The 91st Psalm assures us that those who dwell in the secret place of the Most High are protected from these destructive influences. Another danger mentioned in the psalm is the arrow that flies by day. This expression is clearly a military reference. In ancient times, warriors launched incendiary arrows to attack their enemies by surprise. These arrows flew quickly and could hit unsuspecting targets. The interesting thing is that the Apostle Paul himself, in his letter to the Ephesians, mentions the fiery darts of the evil one and teaches that faith is the shield capable of extinguishing them. Here, once again, the 91st Psalm shows us that the battle we face is not just physical, but spiritual. Arrows that fly during the day can represent accusations, attacks against our faith, destructive words, negative thoughts, and even persecution for the sake of righteousness. The protection promised by God does not mean that these arrows will not be shot at us, but that, as we trust in Him, they will not have the power to destroy us. The psalm also talks about 1,000 falling at our side and 10,000 at our right hand, but that evil will not reach us. This is one of the most cited verses when talking about God's protection, but it must be understood in the correct context. In biblical times, these words would have been understood as a battle scene. In wars, it was common for soldiers to fall around their comrades, but those who were under divine protection remained steadfast. This passage does not mean that we will never face difficulties, but rather that, even in the midst of chaos, God sustains those who trust in Him. It is a powerful image of the Lord's faithfulness in the midst of tribulations. Another interesting detail is the way the psalmist describes the safety of those who trust in God. They will not be struck by night terrors. This is an often overlooked but extremely significant detail. The night, in Hebrew culture, was associated with moments of great vulnerability. In the biblical period, there was no electric light, and darkness represented danger, uncertainty, and fear. Night terrors can symbolize invisible attacks, thoughts of anguish, anxieties, and all types of oppression that try to steal our peace. In several passages of the Bible, we see that the enemy acts more intensely in darkness, trying to disturb people's minds and hearts. However, the 91st Psalm assures us that those who are under the protection of the Most High need not fear. God is a shield not only against physical dangers, but also against invisible attacks that try to shake our faith. Therefore, when we analyze all these dangers mentioned in the psalm, we realize that it is not just talking about physical deliverance, but about a constant spiritual battle. The true secret of the 91st Psalm is not just words of protection, but the profound reality that, in God, we are guarded against the forces of evil that try to destroy us. This is one of the least commented aspects of this psalm. Many cling only to the promises of deliverance and protection, but few realize that these promises are inserted in a context of spiritual warfare. The enemy tries to attack in different ways, with snares, with arrows, with plagues, and with night terrors, but those who live in the presence of God find refuge and safety. This reality leads us to an important reflection. Are we just reciting this psalm mechanically, or do we really understand its deep meaning? Have we truly sought to live under divine protection? Or have we only sought this security when we face difficulties? If you would like to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support. The 91st Psalm invites us to live a life of genuine trust in God, knowing that regardless of the enemy's traps, He is our refuge and strength. Throughout this study, we have delved deeply into the meaning of Psalm 91. We understand that it is not just a text about protection, but a call to a life of intimacy with God. We also understand that this protection does not mean the absence of challenges, but rather the certainty of the divine presence in the midst of difficulties. Now we come to one of the most fascinating parts of this psalm, the promise of angelic intervention. Verse 11 states, "For He will command His angels concerning you, to keep you in all your ways." This is one of the most cited passages by those seeking to understand the role of angels in divine protection. But what does this verse really mean? Throughout the scriptures, we see several moments when angels are sent by God to protect, guide, and strengthen His people. In the book of Genesis, when Hagar and her son Ishmael were about to die in the desert, an angel appeared and showed them a well of water, ensuring their survival. In Daniel, an angel closed the lions' mouths and prevented them from hurting the prophet. In the New Testament, we see angels announcing the birth of Jesus, strengthening Him in Gethsemane, and even rolling away the stone from the tomb after His resurrection. Given this, we can conclude that angels are divine agents who play an active role in the history of redemption. But does this mean that each person has an individual guardian angel, as many believe? The text of Psalm 91 does not specify this idea, but reinforces that God gives orders to His angels to protect those who are under His refuge. This means that angelic protection is not an automatic right for anyone, but rather a manifestation of God's care for those who truly trust in Him. This question becomes even more intriguing when we look at the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 4, we see Satan tempting Jesus in the desert and quoting exactly the 91st Psalm, verses 11 and 12. The devil says, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and they will take you in their hands, so that you will never strike your foot against a stone." This scene is very significant, Satan is trying to use the scriptures to convince Jesus to act presumptuously, throwing himself from the top of the temple, waiting for the angels to save him. However, Jesus responds with another biblical passage. It is also written, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test." This teaches us something fundamental. The protection described in the 91st Psalm cannot be used to justify reckless behavior. Some people interpret this text as if it guarantees that we will never suffer accidents, illnesses, or tragedies. However, even Jesus, who was the Son of God himself, rejected this idea. He knew that trusting God does not mean testing his protection irresponsibly. Unfortunately, throughout history, many have used this psalm incorrectly. Some treat it as a kind of amulet, reciting it mechanically as if it were a magic formula to ward off danger. But trusting God doesn't just mean repeating words. It means living according to His will and obeying His principles. This leads us to a crucial question. How does this angelic protection manifest itself today? Should we expect physical appearances of angels in times of danger? Or does this protection occur in ways that we don't always realize? The Bible gives us some clues. In Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, we find a curious passage. "Do not forget hospitality, for through it some have entertained angels without knowing it." This verse suggests that angelic action can occur discreetly, without us necessarily noticing its presence. Furthermore, in many testimonies throughout history, people have reported inexplicable deliverances, situations in which they were saved from accidents or danger in supernatural ways. Of course, it is not always possible to say with certainty that it was angels acting directly, but the Bible teaches us that God can use His messengers to fulfill His purposes in our lives. But there is an important detail. Angelic protection does not replace human responsibility. God gives us wisdom to make prudent decisions, and trusting in His protection does not mean ignoring the basic care of life. A Christian who lives recklessly, constantly placing himself in situations of unnecessary risk, cannot use the 91st Psalm as a justification for his irresponsibility. Another essential point is that the actions of angels are always aligned with the will of God. They are not independent beings who respond to human whims, but messengers who carry out divine orders. Jesus himself said that he could ask the Father, and he would send legions of angels to free him from crucifixion, but he chose to follow the plan of redemption. This teaches us that divine protection does not always mean being spared suffering, but rather being assured that God is in control, regardless of the circumstances. Therefore, as we read the 91st Psalm and see this promise about angels, we must remember that it is not an invitation to recklessness, nor a guarantee of a life without challenges. It is an affirmation of God's care for those who truly trust Him, walking in His ways and seeking His presence. The Lord's protection is real, but it is not automatic or mechanical. It happens according to His will and purposes. Our part is to abide in Him, trust Him, and live by His principles. When we do this, we can be assured that, whether through His angels or in ways we cannot see, God will always be guarding those who make Him their refuge. Throughout this study, we have uncovered the secrets of Psalm 91 and understood that it goes far beyond a simple text about protection. We saw that dwelling in the secret place of the Most High means living in intimacy with God, and that the promise of deliverance should not be interpreted as an exemption from difficulties, but rather as the guarantee of the divine presence in the midst of adversity. We also explore the action of angels in protecting the faithful, and understand that this intervention occurs according to God's will, without ever replacing our responsibility or being used as a justification for reckless attitudes. Now, we come to a crucial point: the conditions for the promises of Psalm 91 to be fulfilled. Many believe that this psalm guarantees absolute and unconditional deliverance for anyone who recites it. But is this the correct interpretation? Is it enough to just read or declare these words for them to become reality in our lives? The answer lies in the verses of this psalm itself. If we look closely, we will see that he does not promise unrestricted protection for just anyone. but rather for those who meet certain spiritual requirements. And these requirements are mentioned throughout the text. One of the first is in verse 2. I will say of the Lord, He is my God, my refuge, my fortress, and I will trust in Him. This means that the protection described here is for those who make the Lord their refuge, who truly trust in Him. But what does it mean to truly trust God? Trust is not just intellectually believing that God exists. Many people say they believe in God, but they do not live a life of surrender to Him. Trusting God means depending on Him in all areas of life, seeking His will in our decisions, and resting in His promises without anxiety or fear. Another essential point appears in verse 14. Because He has clung to me in love, I will deliver Him. I will set Him on high, because He has known my name. Here we see two clear conditions for the promises of the psalm to be fulfilled: clinging to God with love and knowing His name. Clinging to God with love means developing a deep, intimate relationship with Him. It's not just about seeking God when we're in trouble, but about abiding in Him every day. Many people only remember God when they face difficulties, but forget Him when everything is going well. However, the 91st Psalm makes it clear that the promises of protection are for those who live in covenant with God, and not for those who seek only momentary benefits. Furthermore, knowing God's name does not just mean knowing what He is called, but understanding His character, His nature, and His attributes. In Hebrew culture, a person's name represented their essence, their identity. When the psalm talks about knowing God's name, it is telling us that we need to understand who God really is and trust Him not just as a Savior, but as an absolute Lord over our lives. These conditions show us that the promises of Psalm 91 are not for everyone. They are for those who truly live under God's authority, who love Him, obey Him, and seek Him daily. A biblical example that illustrates this reality well is the life of King David. Throughout the Psalms, we see that David faced many dangers, persecutions, and battles, but he always trusted God as his refuge. In the 23rd Psalm, David declares, Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. This is the true essence of Psalm 91, not the absence of problems, but the certainty of God's presence at all times. On the other hand, the Bible also shows us examples of people who turned away from God and consequently lost His protection. King Saul himself started out well, but as he distanced himself from God's presence and began to rely on his own strength, he lost divine coverage and met a tragic end. This leads us to an important reflection. Are we just reciting the 91st Psalm, or are we truly living according to its principles? Many people cling to the promises of this psalm, but do not care about living the life of intimacy with God that it demands. They want divine protection, but they do not want commitment to the Most High. Another detail that we need to highlight is that God's protection manifests itself in different ways in each situation. In some moments, He can deliver us from physical danger, as He did with Daniel in the lion's den. In others, He may allow us to go through tribulations, but He strengthens us to face them, as He did with the Apostle Paul, who was persecuted, arrested, and even flogged, but never lost his peace and trust in the Lord. This means that trusting God is not seeking a life without difficulties, but rather believing that, regardless of what happens, He will be with us and fulfill His purposes in our lives. This is the true protection of the 91st Psalm, not just immediate deliverance, but eternal security. Therefore, the big question is not whether God protects us or not, as He has already made it clear that He protects those who love and trust Him. The real question is, are we living up to the conditions established to receive this protection? Are we truly taking refuge in God, or do we just seek His promises when it suits us? This psalm is not a free pass to a life without problems, but a call to a deep and sincere relationship with God. And only those who accept this call truly experience the power of these promises. Many people know the 91st Psalm as a powerful promise of deliverance and protection. However, few realize that these promises are not unconditional. Throughout the text, we find principles that determine to whom this protection is guaranteed. The psalm is not a magic formula that works for anyone who recites it, but a commitment between God and those who make him their refuge. This becomes clear at the beginning of the psalm when we read, "I will say of the Lord, He is my God, my refuge, my fortress, and I will trust in him." This statement shows that the security mentioned here is not for everyone, but for those who make a conscious decision to fully trust in the Lord. But what does it mean, in practice, to make God our refuge? Trusting God is not just believing that He exists. Many people recognize the existence of God but live independently, without seeking His presence or obeying His will. True refuge in the Most High happens when we surrender our lives completely to Him, depending on Him for everything and living according to His principles. Another essential detail appears in verse 14. "Because he has clung to me in love, I will deliver him. I will set him on high, because he has known my name." This passage reveals two conditions for the promises of the psalm to be fulfilled: clinging to God with love and knowing His name. Clinging to God in love does not just mean seeking His blessings, but desiring to be in His presence for who He is, not just for what He can offer. It is having an intimate relationship with Him, regardless of the circumstances. Already knowing the name of God means understanding His character, trusting Him, and living according to His principles. In the biblical context, someone's name represented their essence and identity. Knowing the name of God, therefore, is not just knowing what He is called, but understanding deeply who He is. The 91st Psalm does not promise automatic protection for anyone, but for those who make the Lord their true refuge and surrender completely to Him. Many people want to enjoy God's promises, but do not want commitment to Him. They want deliverance in times of crisis, but do not want to live a life of obedience and holiness. However, Scripture makes it clear that those who choose to walk away from God also choose to be outside of His protection. This reality can be seen throughout the Bible. David, for example, faced many difficulties, but he always trusted the Lord as his refuge. He not only recited words of trust, but also lived in constant communion with God. In contrast, Saul, who started out well, ended up turning away from the Lord, becoming vulnerable, and meeting a tragic end. Another essential point is that God's protection can manifest itself in different ways. Sometimes He delivers us from physical danger, as He did with Daniel in the lion's den. Other times, He strengthens us to endure trials, as He did with the Apostle Paul, who went through persecution and imprisonment, but never lost his peace and trust in the Lord. This means that trusting God does not exempt us from challenges, but gives us the security that He is with us in any situation. Therefore, the 91st Psalm is not just a text to be read in difficult times. It is a call to a deep relationship with God. The real question is not whether God protects His own, as He has already made it clear that He protects those who love and trust Him. The question we must ask ourselves is, are we really living under this protection, or are we just seeking promises without commitment to the Almighty? The 91st Psalm has been, over the centuries, one of the most cited texts when it comes to divine protection. His words bring comfort, hope, and security to those who trust in God. However, as we have seen so far, it is not just a set of automatic promises of deliverance, but a call to a life of commitment and intimacy with the Most High. We now come to the final verses of this psalm, where we find one of God's most powerful statements regarding those who take refuge in Him. "He will call on me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him, and I will glorify him. I will give him an abundance of days, and I will show him my salvation." These words reveal a fundamental aspect of divine protection. God not only delivers us from danger, but is also with us in the midst of distress. Many people interpret the 91st Psalm as a promise that we will never face difficulties, but this passage makes it clear that the Lord will be present even in times of trouble. This reminds us of Jesus' words in John, chapter 16, verse 33. "In the world you will have tribulations, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. This is one of the deepest truths of the Christian faith. God never promised a life without struggles, but He guaranteed that we would never be alone in them. The phrase, "He will call on me, and I will answer him," reinforces the role of prayer in the lives of those who trust in God. The protection mentioned in the 91st Psalm is not passive. It involves an active relationship with the Lord. It is not enough to just know God's promises. It is necessary to seek His presence, call on Him in times of need, and trust Him in all circumstances. The stories of so many biblical characters confirm this truth. Joseph was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, and unjustly imprisoned, but he remained faithful to God, and at the right time, he was exalted. Job lost everything he had and faced extreme suffering, but he never stopped crying out to the Lord, and his restoration came with a double measure of blessings. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, but he prayed and trusted God, and he was protected. In all these stories, we see a clear pattern. Those who make God their refuge may go through difficult times, but they are never abandoned. Another powerful detail is the final promise of the 91st Psalm. I will give him an abundance of days, and I will show him my salvation. This phrase does not just refer to physical longevity, but to the fullness of life in God. The true abundance of days is not just in the number of years we live, but in the quality of our walk with the Lord. This concept becomes even clearer when we look at the last word of the psalm, salvation. In Hebrew, the word used here is Yeshua, which means salvation or liberation, and which, interestingly, is the Hebrew name of Jesus. This means that the greatest promise of the 91st Psalm is not just protection from earthly dangers, but the guarantee of eternal salvation for those who make the Lord their refuge. This is one of the biggest secrets of this psalm that often goes unnoticed. It is not just a momentary protection in this life, but an invitation to trust in God beyond this existence. After all, what would be the point of living 100 years without ever facing danger, but losing eternal life? True security is in being in the hands of the Lord, not just in the present time, but for all eternity. This understanding helps us see Psalm 91 in a much deeper way. It is not a shield against every problem, nor is it a promise that we will never face difficulties. But He is the certainty that, regardless of what happens, God is with us, keeps us, strengthens us, and above all, leads us to salvation. At the end of this journey, the big question remains: are we really living under these promises, or are we just repeating words without understanding? Are we seeking God only in times of difficulty, or living in His presence continually? Psalm 91 teaches us that true protection is not in reciting words, but in making the Lord our refuge. And when we live this way, we can be completely sure that He keeps us, responds to us, strengthens us, and, at the right time, shows us His salvation. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support. The 91st Psalm is more than a set of promises. It is an invitation to a life of intimacy with God and to a faith that transcends difficulties. Now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this psalm spoke most to your heart? Have you ever experienced God's protection in difficult times? Share your experience in the comments. I'd love to know. And if this study made sense to you, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. This helps us to continue bringing content like this to you. Now, if you want to continue this journey of spiritual growth and discover biblical truths that you may have never heard before, don't stop here. I have another video that will open your vision of the scriptures even further. Click here and come with me to the next study.